When the world burned, no one noticed the exact moment when life stopped being life. There were explosions, light, terror, but the true end didn't come with bombs. It came silently, crawling through smoking ruins, as if it had been waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. People called it the Day of Ashes, but the few survivors knew a name that simple could never explain what had happened. The truth was that something had awakened, something ancient, patient, hungry, and the entire planet had become only the first sacrifice. The underground shelter where a few had managed to hide was as tight as a coffin. The metal walls vibrated with every tremor from the surface, and there were nights when everyone heard dragging footsteps above them, as if something gigantic were walking through the ruins, sniffing around, searching for doors, cracks, signs of life. No one dared speak in those hours. Some covered their mouths so they wouldn't scream. Others just trembled, hoping that thing would go away. But nothing ever really went away. One of the people in the shelter, a pale woman known only as the Watcher, had dreams that everyone feared. She said something watched her from inside the visions, something with eyes so black they seemed to suck everything around them in. She said the world above wasn't empty. It was being prepared, shaped, purified, and that when the darkness came down completely, no one would have any chance to hide. The others told her to be quiet, but they never managed to ignore her. Her words sank in like stingers. Outside, the air had a metallic taste. Ashes fell like poisonous snow. There were places where the ground opened, breathed, closed again, as if it were alive. The few who tried to go out didn't return, and when they did come back, they were no longer the same. The first one returned at dawn, staggering. His skin was marked as if invisible hands had gripped his body hard enough to leave deep bruises. His eyes were too wide, and there was a crooked smile that didn't move with the rest of his face. When he tried to speak, only a wet, gurgling sound came out until he opened his mouth and something crawled out. A thin thread of darkness, like solid smoke, before he dropped dead. After that, the shelter began to die from the inside. The hallways grew colder, as if something were sucking the heat from the lamps. Objects changed places. Whispers spread even when everyone was asleep. Doors locked by themselves. And the Watcher got worse every day. She muttered broken sentences, said he was descending, that he was choosing, that no one had been saved down there. There was no salvation. There was only time. And it was running out. The leaders of the shelter decided they had to move. They didn't know where, but staying there would mean dying slowly. The group gathered weapons, masks, flashlights, and walked to the exit. The hot air on the surface hit their faces like the breath of a furnace. The world was red, the sky murky, the ground cracked, and on the horizon something moved, something too big to be clearly seen, like a silhouette stretching for miles, dissolving reality around it. In that setting, they had to cross kilometers to reach the next shelter, which supposedly existed. But each step was haunted by distant echoes, like children's voices calling for help, distorted laughter, and shadows dragging themselves against the pale light. With every passing hour, fewer people remained in the group. Some vanished without a sound. Others were pulled down by something rising under the ground. There were those who begged to return to the underground shelter, even knowing what was there, because nothing seemed worse than what now walked at their side. The Watcher said it wasn't the end. It was only the rebirth. That the true master of the new world was already walking among them, invisible, waiting for the exact moment to reveal himself. She said he didn't need to kill. The world was already dead. He only needed to harvest what was left. And, in fact, something started following the group. The sound of slow footsteps came from behind them every night, always distant, always constant. People tried to sleep, but the noise grew closer. Sometimes it seemed just a few meters away. Other times it seemed to echo inside their own heads. When they tried to look back, they saw nothing, but they felt the weight of a gaze, as if something were occupying the space between atoms. The group went insane slowly. One of the survivors began drawing symbols on the ground, symbols she had never seen before, but that rose in her mind like old scars. Another started laughing to himself and tearing out his own hair. A third stared fixedly at the horizon, muttering that the world was being remade, that there was no turning back, that they were only leftovers. That was when the earth shook. Far away, a structure emerged, a mansion with an old appearance but completely intact, standing in the middle of nowhere as if it had been teleported there. The Watcher fell to her knees when she saw it. She said that house was not just a house. It was an invitation, a refuge for those who would be spared, a place where the Chosen One would rest before completing his transformation. The group didn't want to enter, but the alternative was to die out there. They walked to the mansion, and the door opened by itself, as if it had been waiting. The interior was clean, too perfumed, too silent. Portraits showed people who looked alive, as if they could step out of the frame at any moment. Each hallway had mirrors, and every mirror reflected a distorted version of the people, versions that smiled while they watched the group. It didn't take long for everyone to realize they were trapped. The mansion shut itself. The windows disappeared, doors moved, bedrooms changed places. Sometimes when they woke up, someone was in a different room, even though they had gone to sleep together. And every night a figure appeared at the end of the corridor, tall, thin, with horns that curved like roots. It never came closer. It only watched, until one day it did come closer. The Watcher was taken first. She walked toward the creature as if she were seeing a deity. They tried to hold her, but the air around her grew so hot that their hands burned. The Watcher fell in front of the entity, and when it touched her forehead, the woman's eyes went dark, and a red light passed through her chest, lighting up every vein. Then she spoke with a voice that was not human. The new world begins now. The mansion shuddered, the walls pulsed, the paintings started to bleed, the mirrors exploded into shards that floated in the air like blades. The floor opened, revealing faces screaming, trapped in living wood. The survivors ran, but the mansion was infinite, as if it expanded with every step. And the creature walked behind them. Every touch made the world fall apart, fold, and remake itself. There was no physical escape. The exit wasn't a place, but a state, and none of them knew how to reach it. One by one they were claimed by the house, some were swallowed by the walls, others dragged down by black hands rising from the floor. The entity watched everything with a cruel calm, like a proud father watching his children finally understand that resisting was useless. In the end, only one person remained, the last survivor of the group, running through corridors that changed direction like a living maze. The mansion seemed to breathe in the quick rhythm of that person's despair, until they found a different door, small, made of dark wood, cold. Upon opening it, they didn't find a room. They found the world. Not the world from before, but what came after. The sky was completely black. The moon was split in half. The ground pulsed like flesh. Creatures crawled for miles away like shadows trying to shake off their own shape. And in the center there was a throne made of bones, where someone, a human figure, young, with completely white eyes, watched everything. He smiled, and in that instant the person understood. None of it was an accident. None of it was chaos. Everything had been planned. "Welcome to the beginning," he said. "The old world is over. Now you're going to watch while mine awakens." And when the horned creature appeared behind the person, the darkness swallowed everything. The end was not the end. It was only the first chapter of what was coming. A reign of shadows, a world rebuilt from zero, where humans owned nothing anymore. Only witnesses, only food, only echoes of a creation that had never belonged to them. And in that new world the mansion remained, waiting for new survivors, waiting for new sacrifices, waiting for the next awakening. The mansion waited in silence, but its silence was never empty. It fed on the footsteps that approached, on hopes that arrived in crumbs, on voices begging for salvation before a world that had been abandoned long before the bombs fell. With time, rumors started to circulate among the few groups of survivors that still wandered through the ash desert of the old world. They spoke of an intact place. They spoke of a refuge where food never ran out, where the cold didn't win, where death had no power. They spoke of a house that appeared where nothing had existed before, as if it had grown straight out of hell. And the desperate always followed rumors. One of those groups walked on the edge of collapse when they saw, in the distance, the silhouette of the mansion outlined against a sky that was far too dark. They were people who were strangers to one another, united only by the need not to die alone. There was a former soldier with an empty stare, a woman who carried a book wrapped in chains, a religious man with a broken cross hanging from his neck, and a young girl who never spoke but always seemed to hear something the others could not. When they saw the mansion, they didn't feel relief. They felt something worse. A recognition that made no sense. It was as if they had been there before. The girl, the one who never spoke, was the only one who stopped walking. The others advanced as if pushed by hunger, exhaustion, and the promise of shelter. But she stayed behind, her eyes locked on the house. Her lips moved silently, and if someone had gotten close enough, they would have seen that she whispered a single phrase, repeated like a forgotten mantra. "Not again." Even so, she walked. The door opened by itself before anyone could touch the handle. Hot air escaped from inside, carrying a sweet, sickening perfume, like flowers left too long on a corpse. The main hall was tidy, lit by chandeliers that shouldn't have been lit, since no one had lived there for long enough for the world to end and start again. But the mansion didn't obey time. It obeyed cycles. The former soldier was the first to enter, inspecting every corner, looking for visible threats. But nothing there was visible at first glance. The woman with the chained book came in next, and the house reacted immediately. The candles flickered. The paintings trembled slightly. A crack appeared in the wall, as if something had laughed from inside it. The broken cross on the religious man's chest began to heat up, burning his skin, and the silent girl felt something shift behind her eyes, as if memories were being ripped out from where they'd been locked away. Nothing seemed wrong, and yet everything was deeply wrong. The mansion welcomed them as it had welcomed others before. It offered rooms, it offered beds, it offered food. A feast was laid out on a dark wooden table that looked like it had been used for many celebrations and also for many sacrifices. There was far too much red wine, meat that was too tender, fruit too perfect for a world that was rotting outside. The religious man refused. He quoted verses with a trembling voice, saying none of that could be real, that it was a trap, that the true test wasn't surviving the bombs, but refusing what was offered after the end. The others listened but did not obey. The smell of food cut through any human resistance. The woman with the book just watched. She knew how to recognize pacts. She knew nothing is offered for free. She knew everything there had a price. When she saw a symbol discreetly carved into the edge of the table, the air left her lungs. A circle crossed by a vertical line with two small strokes at the top, like antennae or horns. She had seen that symbol before, in the pages of burned grimoires, in the margins of forbidden manuscripts, in nightmares that didn't end even after waking. It was the seal of the Heir. She didn't know his name. No one did. Those who knew were no longer alive, but every practitioner who had meddled with magic that was too ancient knew the concept. The Heir was not only the end, he was what came after the end. While the others ate, laughing as if they had forgotten the hunger that had almost killed them, the woman with the chained book took a step back and felt the ground pulsing lightly under her feet, as if the house had a heart. When she looked out the window, she didn't see the world outside. There were no ruins, no shattered sky, no ash desert. Everything that existed outside the mansion was liquid darkness, something that moved slowly, as if it breathed. Only then did she realize they weren't in a shelter. They were inside a womb. The ex-soldier drank too much wine. His eyes started to grow heavy, his vision blurry. When he tried to stand, his legs wouldn't respond. He fell to his knees and, for a moment, thought it was just exhaustion. But then he felt something sliding down his throat. It wasn't liquid. It was cold and thick, like a thread of shadow entering through his mouth and spreading inside him, taking shape in every vein, every cell. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The others kept eating, as if they couldn't see what was happening. The mansion chose what it allowed to be seen. His body convulsed, bones cracked, skin seemed to adjust to something growing inside. When he finally managed to raise his head, his eyes were no longer human, and a strange, forced smile opened on his face, tearing the corners of his mouth slightly. The silent girl stared at him, and for the first time she spoke. "He's already here." Her voice sounded older than her body, more tired than her skin, more worn out than any soul should be. The candles all went out at once. Darkness flooded the room, but it wasn't normal darkness. It was a presence. It had weight, texture, smell, intention. At the end of the table, where the head chair was empty, a figure began to take shape. First, the chair moved by itself. Then a shadow formed above it. Leg by leg, arm by arm, face by face. It was someone far too young to be sitting on a throne of bones. But the eyes didn't match that youth. They were ancient, deep, full of memories no human should carry. He watched the group in silence. The ex-soldier now hunched, with something growing inside. The religious man holding the cross burning into his chest, yet unable to let go. The woman with the chained book, trembling yet standing firm. The silent girl who stared at him not with fear, but with profound exhaustion. "You keep coming," he said with disturbing calm, "even when you know." The religious man tried to say something about faith, about resistance, about the power of light. But the words died in his mouth. His tongue grew hard, heavy, until it crumbled to dust inside his own mouth. He began to dry cough, spitting gray powder that fell onto the plate like a profane communion. With each cough, fragments of forgotten prayers came out, evaporating in the air. The cross he was holding bent by itself, melting as if made of wax, until it took the shape of that same symbol, the circle, the line, the horn-like strokes. The woman with the book knew that wasn't just cruelty, it was rewriting. Everything that once represented protection now came to represent dominion. The heir raised his hand, and the ex-soldier stood up like a puppet, his eyes now completely black. The voice, when it came, wasn't his. "The world was a mistake," he declared, looking at the woman with the book. "The attempt to live without the true owner." "And you are that owner," she answered, not wanting to say those words but saying them anyway, as if something were pulling mental strings from inside. "I am what comes after," he corrected, smiling. "You called apocalypse what was only the removal of the old scenery." The mansion trembled. The paintings began to change. Images of smiling people twisted, growing horns, empty eyes, too many mouths. The reflections of those still alive were trapped inside the glass, as if a version of them had been torn out and condemned to stay there forever, laughing in fear and pain. The silent girl started to cry, but it wasn't normal crying. Each tear that hit the floor became a small burned symbol. The same seal, the same circle, the same line. "I remember," she whispered. "We've done this before." "Many times," the heir agreed, without breaking eye contact. "You always come back to the house. Why? Because this is where the world ends and begins again." She backed away, stumbling, her back hitting the wall. But the wall gave in. Hands came out of it. Human hands, cold, hungry, trying to grab her and pull her to the other side, where there was only darkness and screams. The woman with the book tried to pull her back, holding her with all her strength. The mansion loved disputes. It loved to see which would win, the will of the living, or the appetite of what had died long ago. The chains around the book began to vibrate, as if something inside it were waking up. They had never moved that way, never seemed so impatient. She understood that it wasn't just a grimoire. It was a prison, a piece of the old world locked in words, a fragment of power that refused the heir's dominion. She could open it, but nothing that is opened ever returns to what it was before. "You know what you have there," the heir remarked, unmoving. "An old mistake." "A mistake like the world," she replied, feeling the chains heat up. "No," he smiled, "something that tried to stop the inevitable." The religious man was still on his knees, mute, coughing dust, until he finally fell. His body crumbled on the floor, disintegrating as if he had never existed. All that remained was a mark on the ground, burned in, smoking lightly. The silent girl was still trapped in the wall's hands. Some of them were too small. Children's hands, short fingernails, thin skin. Faces began to appear behind the fingers, screaming without sound. You can let her go, the heir said, but you know she is no longer just herself. What does that mean? She remembers. The woman with the book brought her face closer to the girl's. In her eyes there was more than fear. There was recognition. Images started to pass through the air between them. Not like common visions, but like pieces of reality torn from the fabric of time. They saw themselves in another era, in another world, before the bombs, before the ashes. They saw a coven of witches hidden in an old school. They saw rituals of protection. They saw women trying to keep alive the last spark of a doomed balance. They saw the birth of the heir. They saw the world end for the first time. And they saw something worse. They saw themselves taking part in a deal they didn't remember. A pact made in a rush, with too much fear, too much hope. A bargain. If they couldn't stop the end, maybe they could restart everything. But the price was high. One of them would be the anchor of the cycle, condemned to be reborn, bound to the house, remembering everything, being a witness to each end and each new beginning. The silent girl was that anchor, and the woman with the book had been the one who sealed the pact. "I did this to you," she murmured, her voice cracking. "Many times," the girl replied, "and you always promise that next time you'll let it all end." The heir watched with interest. The mansion vibrated with anticipation. "I cannot allow the end," the woman insisted, desperate. "Someone has to try to fix it." "You don't fix," the heir said calmly. "You prolong." The screams trapped in the walls grew louder. The hands pulled harder. The girl was almost swallowed, but the woman held on with all the strength she had until she felt her arms burning from the inside. Then she made a decision she didn't remember ever making before. A new decision. The chains around the book cracked when she started reciting words she had never dared to pronounce. The grimoire shook in her hands, heavy, almost impossible to hold. Each syllable that left her mouth felt like it was ripping pieces from her soul, tearing, cutting, burning. The mansion reacted immediately. The walls swelled, the floor opened, the chandeliers spun, spinning, 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 until they broke free and exploded mid-air, filling everything with shards that didn't fall to the ground, only floated like sharp stars. The heir rose from the throne, for the first time looking uncomfortable. "You don't know what you're releasing," he warned. "And you don't know what I'm willing to lose," she shot back. The book opened on its own. A dense, dark smoke flowed out, but it wasn't like the darkness outside the house. This one was cold. It smelled of wet earth, of ancient blood, of screams that had never quite been heard. Shapes began to form in the air. They weren't angels. They weren't demons. They were something in between, remnants of everything that had been erased so that the new world could be born. Their presence wounded the space. It cracked the walls of the mansion's reality. For a second, the floor didn't show wood, but an absolute abyss, where countless versions of the world fell at the same time, each in a different stage of destruction. The heir looked around, his smile faded, his eyes narrowed. "You didn't learn," he growled. "You repeat the same mistakes with different shapes. Maybe the mistake is to keep accepting that you're the end of everything," the woman answered, blood running from her ears, her eyes, her mouth. "I am inevitable." The silent girl managed to break free from the hands in the wall, But now those hands tried to grab the heir, to pull him from the throne, to drag the very axis of the new world into the abyss. He couldn't be destroyed, but he could be displaced. The grimoire remained open. The freed entities circled the hall, passing through bodies, walls, memories. They weren't there to help humans. They didn't know the concept of mercy. They were there only because they had been called. The mansion howled, not with sound, but with displacement. Every room turned around an invisible axis, as if the entire house were being twisted, folded, crushed between the hands of something looking from outside time. The woman with the book knew she would not survive. She already felt her bones dissolve, her flesh becoming translucent, her fingers starting to fade like smoke. The girl knelt in front of her, holding her face. "It's all going to start again," the anchor said. "You know that. Not if I manage to break the cycle now. You've tried before." The sentence drove spikes into the woman's mind. Images of other cycles flashed before her. Other times she had held the same book. Other times she had opened it. Other times she had released the same entities. And always, at some point, something failed. Something pulled everything back to the mansion, to the throne, to the heir. "What's missing?" she whispered, almost voiceless. "You," the girl answered. In that instant she understood. The pact that created the anchor had not charged only the girl. It had a price for the one who sealed it too. She had never paid it in full. Every time the mansion brought her back, every time the cycle restarted, every time a part of her was spared because the sacrifice had not been total. The freed entities whirled like a swarm of conscious darkness. The air fought against the hands of the abyss. Parts of his body disappeared and reappeared in different points of the room, sometimes in flesh, sometimes in shadow. "You cannot erase me," he roared, his voice making the house crack. "I am what comes after." "Then maybe nothing should come after," the woman replied, finally accepting what she had to do. She turned the book against her own chest. The chains tightened on their own, piercing her back, entering her flesh, wrapping around her heart. Every link burned like molten metal. She felt her blood stop. She felt time falter around her body. The mansion waited. The heir realized too late what was happening. "If you extinguish yourself, there'll be no axis to hold the rupture," he shouted. "The void will swallow everything." She smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in a long time. "I know." The grimoire began to fuse with her body. Page by page, word by word, the imprisoned knowledge, the curses, the ancient names, the commands, everything mixed with her existence, becoming a single point of collapse. The young anchor started screaming, trying to hold on, trying to stop her. But the hands from the wall pulled her back again. This time not to imprison her, but to protect her. The cycle required someone to remember. The woman with the book didn't want to remember anymore. When her heart stopped, the entire world failed. For an instant there was no sky, no ground, no mansion, no air. Only absolute silence, heavy, total. Then came the sound. A dry blast, like millions of doors opening and closing at the same time, like billions of breaths being forced back into lungs, like an entire story being rewound all the way to the beginning. But there was no beginning to return to. The cycle broke. The mansion crumbled into dark dust, spreading through nothing. The bone throne cracked, each fragment containing an echo of the heir's face, screaming without sound as it shattered in directions that did not exist. The freed entities were swallowed by the very void they had helped open, and the silent girl was left alone. There was no floor beneath her feet anymore, no body around her. She was only consciousness, floating in a space she couldn't define. There was no light, no shadow, no reference. But there was memory. She remembered every cycle, every mansion, every group of survivors entering, thinking they'd find shelter, every broken promise from the woman with the book, every smile from the heir as everything restarted the same way. Now none of that existed, only the memory. The memory was a weight, a ballast, a thread, and that was dangerous, because memory is the material with which new worlds are molded. Something moved in the void, a tiny point, a spark, and almost nothing. The silent girl felt something like a wind without direction. It had nowhere to blow, yet it chose her anyway. An ancient voice echoed. It wasn't the heir's voice. It wasn't the woman with the books. It wasn't any creature she knew. It was the voice of the void itself. "What do you want?" The question had no sound, but it was understood. She hesitated. She had the chance to want nothing, to let it all end there, to allow absence to reign forever. But humans are incapable of wanting nothing. She thought of shelter. She thought of walls. She thought of a place where there were no bombs, no ashes, no symbols carved into flesh. She thought of a house. The spark expanded. The void trembled. And before she could regret it, the shape began to appear. First the outline, then the windows, then the door, then the roof. A mansion, almost identical to the previous one, almost. This time there was no throne of bones in the main hall, no portraits of smiling people, no mirrors lining the corridors. It was an empty house, in a place where there was no sky, no earth. The mansion floated in nothing. Ready. The silent girl realized too late the instinctive mistake. She didn't want to reproduce the cycle. But memory doesn't obey will. Memory repeats. "You cannot erase me," he roared, his voice making the house crack. "I am what comes after." "Then maybe nothing should come after," the woman replied, finally accepting what she had to do. She turned the book against her own chest. The chains tightened on their own, piercing her back, entering her flesh, wrapping around her heart. Every link burned like molten metal. She felt her blood stop. She felt time falter around her body. The mansion waited. The heir realized too late what was happening. "If you extinguish yourself, there'll be no axis to hold the rupture," he shouted. "The void will swallow everything." She smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in a long time. "I know." The grimoire began to fuse with her body, page by page, word by word. The imprisoned knowledge, the curses, the ancient names, the commands, everything mixed with her existence, becoming a single point of collapse. The young anchor started screaming, trying to hold on, trying to stop her. But the hands from the wall pulled her back again. This time not to imprison her, but to protect her. The cycle required someone to remember. The woman with the book didn't want to remember anymore. When her heart stopped, the entire world failed. For an instant there was no sky, no ground, no mansion, no air, only absolute silence, heavy, total. Then came the sound, a dry blast, like millions of doors opening and closing at the same time, like billions of breaths being forced back into lungs, like an entire story being rewound all the way to the beginning. But there was no beginning to return to. The cycle broke. The mansion crumbled into dark dust, spreading through nothing. The bone throne cracked, each fragment containing an echo of the heir's face, screaming without sound as it shattered in directions that did not exist. The freed entities were swallowed by the very void they had helped open, and the silent girl was left alone. There was no floor beneath her feet anymore, no body around her. She was only consciousness, floating in a space she couldn't define. There was no light, no shadow, no reference, but there was memory. She remembered every cycle, every mansion, every group of survivors entering thinking they'd find shelter, every broken promise from the woman with the book, every smile from the heir as everything restarted the same way. Now, none of that existed, only the memory. The memory was a weight, a ballast, a thread, and that was dangerous, because memory is the material with which new worlds are molded. Something moved in the void, a tiny point, a spark, and almost nothing. The silent girl felt something like a wind without direction. It had nowhere to blow, yet it chose her anyway. An ancient voice echoed. It wasn't the heir's voice. It wasn't the woman with the books. It wasn't any creature she knew. It was the voice of the void itself. What do you want? The question had no sound, but it was understood. She hesitated. She had the chance to want nothing, to let it all end there, to allow absence to reign forever. But humans are incapable of wanting nothing. She thought of shelter. She thought of walls. She thought of a place where there were no bombs, no ashes, no symbols carved into flesh. She thought of a house. The spark expanded. The void trembled. And before she could regret it, the shape began to appear. First the outline, then the windows, then the door, then the roof. A mansion, almost identical to the previous one. Almost. This time there was no throne of bones in the main hall, no portraits of smiling people, no mirrors lining the corridors. It was an empty house, in a place where there was no sky, no earth. The mansion floated in nothing. Ready. The silent girl realized too late the instinctive mistake. She didn't want to reproduce the cycle. But memory doesn't obey will. Memory repeats. A figure appeared in the entrance hall, her standing, with a body, with hands, with skin, breathing, frightened, alone. She walked through the empty corridors. There were no whispers, no shadows, no presences. But the house had a faint pulse, distant, as if it had just been born. She went to the front door. When she tried to open it, she saw something outside. It was not the ash desert, not the cracked sky. It was darkness, pure, total, but different from before. Before, the darkness was hungry. Now, it seemed to wait. She took a step back. "I did this again," she whispered, desperate. "Again." Another voice answered. "Not exactly." She turned. Her heart raced. It wasn't the heir. It wasn't any of the entities she remembered. It was a shadow shaped like a person, without a face, without defined edges. She understood the void had no form of its own, so it borrowed the most comfortable concept in the mind of whoever looked at it. "You didn't bring him back," the shadow said. "Only the idea of shelter. But the house is the beginning of the end. The house is the beginning of whatever you choose." The words were dangerous, seductive. "And if I choose nothing?" the girl asked, her voice breaking. "Nothing cannot sustain itself," the shadow replied. "You've already proven that." She knew. She had tried. For a moment there had been only the void, but even in the void she had remembered the house. The old world is gone, the shadow continued. The cycle was broken when the sacrifice was finally completed. Then why am I still here? Because someone needs to decide what comes after. She thought of people, faces, voices, screams, and the mansion reacted. Hallways stretched, doors appeared, stairs unfolded, memories echoed through the walls, fragments of laughter, pieces of dialogue, sighs of fear. The shadow took a step closer. "You can create a new world," it whispered. "One without the air." The idea was far too tempting, but dangers always have the same scent. "And what do I pay for that?" "Everything that's left of you." She looked at her own hands. She saw through the skin. She saw the cycles. She saw the mansion being built and destroyed countless times. She saw people entering, people dying, people begging. There wasn't much of her that wasn't memory anymore. "And if I refuse?" "The nothing closes," the shadow replied, "and there will be nothing else." "Wouldn't that be better?" "Not for you." The mansion pulsed stronger. One of the doors opened by itself. On the other side, an empty room, a made bed, a window looking out on nothing. She could fill it. Walls, world, sky. But everything that would be born would come from the memories she carried, from her scars. What kind of world could come from someone shaped by apocalypses? She gave a faint smile. It was a far too sad smile. "Maybe the problem was never the heir," she murmured. "Maybe the problem was the idea that someone has to inherit." The shadow stepped back slightly. "Explain." "As long as there's a throne, there will always be something to sit on it." The mansion fell silent. The walls listened. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and for the first time in countless cycles, she didn't think of shelter. She didn't think of protection. She didn't think of a house. She thought of horizon, a space too open to be controlled, too wide to be fenced in, too alive to be locked between walls. When she opened her eyes, the mansion trembled again. But this time it wasn't like before. It wasn't the tremor of something being possessed. It was the tremor of something being abandoned. Each room began to dissolve into luminous dust, not dark, not heavy. The house cried, but not with screams, with soft creaks, with cracks that sounded like sighs of relief. The girl walked to the center of the hall. The floor under her feet was the last solid piece left. The shadow tried to speak, but its voice failed. It didn't know how to act in a scenario without cycles, without repetitive restarts. "If there's no place," the girl said, "there'll be nowhere to build a throne." The floor vanished. She fell. But there was no fall, because there was no direction anymore, no up, no down. Only the feeling of finally letting go of something she had carried for far too long. Memories began to loosen. First the recent ones, then the old ones, then the ones with no date. The most painful tried to stay, but even they slipped away. Images of the mansion, of the heir, of the woman with the book, of the survivors, of the ash desert, of the bombs, of the cracked sky, all were swallowed by a flash so intense it couldn't be called light or darkness. And then there was no more her, no world, no mansion, nothing. For a time that couldn't be counted, the void was truly empty. No will, no witness, no memory. Only later, much later, something too small to notice moved. It wasn't the mansion. It wasn't the heir. It wasn't a house. It wasn't a throne. It was a sound, a single sound, a heart, beating for the first time somewhere that didn't have a name yet. There were no walls, No symbols, no seals, only a small body being formed from a fabric that had never known destruction. Outside that possible future, nothing remembered the end, but somewhere remote, so distant, no living being would ever reach it. A speck of dark dust turned slowly, the last grain of what had once been the mansion. It had no form, no will, but it had one dangerous characteristic: persistence. Because horror never disappears completely, it hides, sleeps, waits. One day, in a world that had never known bombs, nor ashes, nor apocalypse, someone would feel a strange call while looking at an empty hill, and would swear they saw, for a second, the silhouette of a house that shouldn't be there.